Conversations with Niki is brought to you by studyapps.co.za, South Africa's leading education app for tablets. Welcome. Yes, it is. Conversations with Niki. I'm Niki Seberini. Delighted to be with you, and thank you so much for tuning in. And I'd also like to welcome our syndication partner listeners, and that is, of course, MC Palet FM. It's Neisner FM. We have Bay FM from PE and Wild Coast FM, and that is East London. It is fabulous to have you on board. So, every week I have the opportunity of coming into the studio and sitting opposite very interesting people. And when I say interesting, people have experienced all sorts of things, personal trials and tribulations, perhaps professional. Maybe they've done something extraordinary in helping other people. And I find it incredibly motivating. I find it inspiring. And every now and then I come across someone who really makes me think about things over and over again. Now, my guest this week, I think, is definitely one of those. I followed him for many years. And I can say quite honestly that he has shocked me. He's filled me with much joy and laughter. And he's got me thinking time and time again about topics, about issues that perhaps I'm not always comfortable thinking about. And I think because of that, he has been criticized heavily. He's been followed. There's a great following. And he has very many interesting stories to share. So that is why I decided to invite David Bullard into the studio to join us for an interesting conversation. David Bullard, columnist, author, celebrity speaker. I mean, you speak at all sorts of events. David, welcome.
Thanks, Niki. Thanks very much. Lovely to be here. And I have to say that for those down on the coast, always lovely to speak to them as well. But we are enjoying a stunning day in Joburg.
How lucky are we?
I don't think we haven't had summer here, have we, really?
No.
Or winter.
Winter.
We've had summer instead of winter.
I'm not talking about it, though. Because I find if I talk about it, things change.
We did have that snowstorm in the middle of August last year. So we'll be
quiet
today.
We will, just gently. Now listen, you have been described as contentious, inflammable, scathing, funny, witty, candid, racist.
Yeah, those are the nice ones. Can you imagine the bad things people say about me?
There's brilliance. I mean, I'm not going to go into those who've raved about you.
No,
so, David, hang on. What stands out? Which one do you really like? Which resonates deeply with you?
I quite like racist because it came from a good source. It came from the Sunday Times, and we know we can believe everything that they write. And of course, once you've been labelled that amongst the people who followed you for about 14 years, it sort of tends to mean that you've got the guts to tell it like it is. It's a word that's been a little bit overused here to sort of borrow from Gresham's law of money. The more you misuse a word, the less it's really worth. And I think that's probably one of the situations with that as well.
So, David, tell me, I mean, we're going to be talking about that column. I'm just indicating because I left an important note in my black file over there. So I'm waiting to get my hands on that one because, there's a whole lot of important information. And I want to talk about this article and the whole racist article and, obviously the responses and your change in life. But I'd like to go back in time because most people think that that's all you have done is write and write these columns and be very critical and very challenging and very witty and share a fabulous story. But in fact, it's not. This was kind of like a midlife crisis for you becoming a journalist, wasn't it?
No, it was, Niki. I mean, I came out to South Africa in 1981. I was headhunted, brought out to head up a financial company here, and a small financial company, and I did that. I came out from London. I then joined a company called National Discount House under Derek Keyes, who is an ex-minister of finance, ex-cabinet minister here. He was the chairman then. I then joined a merchant bank in '86, and then I started my own company trading in options, which is a derivative market, in '87. And the options market had just started. I was one of the guys who spoke at a conference to get it going in '84, along with other more notable people like G.T. Ferreira, Paul Harris, and those sort of guys. And we really just decided that it would be a good idea to get a derivative market going if we could, and it worked out remarkably well, to the extent that I started a company in 1987 called Johannesburg Options Market. We didn't want to be modest about the name, and we immediately got legal action from the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and we
wonderful.
said to them, well, as you don't deal in options, how can you actually have a problem with this?
The birth of the contentious...
And we stayed in business for 10 years. I then went on a sabbatical and decided that after 24 years, which it had been in financial markets, that I'd probably had enough. And I'd started writing the Out to Lunch column while I was running my company. So it was in 1994 that Out to Lunch started in the Sunday Times. And I thought it might be quite fun just to sort of spend a bit of time, having a bash at being a journalist. And I think this is what annoys so many of journalists today, that it's sort of like I segued across from financial markets, and we were pretty successful there. Not successful enough to buy a wine farm, but we were pretty successful there, and it gave me the sort of wherewithal to go into writing and not to be that bothered about what the editor thought about it. And I think that was the success of Out to Lunch, because although it took them 14 years to sack me, they'd had a very good run from that point of view. I'd also had a very good run, but I think it's fair to say that I was emboldened to write what I wrote every week on the basis that if I didn't have the job, it really meant not a row of beans as far as I was concerned. Now, the odd thing is...
Do you think that's what makes all the difference?
Well, I think it does, because I have to say that since I was sacked, and of course the rules have changed now, the rules are quite interesting in this country. You can be sacked for something that the newspaper has already published, and of course this was the big argument about the offending column. The newspaper had it 5 days before it appeared, and I was only sacked 4 days after. And I would always suggest, with respect, as they say in the legal profession, that if you've done something really bad, like steal from the widows and orphans, you sack the person on the day it's discovered. You don't think about it for 4 or 5 days. I was also actually sacked 2 days after I resigned, because I said, if you have a problem with the content of the column, why did you publish it? The editor didn't quite have an answer for that one, and I said, well, look, let's call it a day. I'll pull the column. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, no more Out to Lunch column. No, that's not necessary. So they turned down my resignation on Tuesday, I think it was the 8th of April 2008, so they could sack me 2 days later, and it would give them a bit more glory.
Well, I mean, the story is huge. As you say, it was in every newspaper.
Yeah.
Everyone was talking about it for 6 weeks after that.
Yeah, it was massive.
And it was a huge shift in your life. But you talk about this emboldened approach, and you started off that way because you had your career. I mean, that's what you were.
Yeah,
you were
and I was doing other things. I had other sources of income as well.
As a child, younger, growing up, were you encouraged to express your opinion?
No, I got a thing on an old school report, Niki. It said David is a disruptive influence. That was when I was 11, and I decided to build on the one thing I was good at. And I quite like, I grew up with things like Not the 9 O'Clock News and Monty Python and Private Eye magazine and Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, and going back further than that, The Goon Show. So I always had a sort of sense of the ridiculous, and what I tried to do in the column was to take a South African issue and perhaps not treat it in the same way as everyone else, maybe sort of turn it round. I described it once a bit like a Rubik Cube, I twisted the colours around. It was up to you to try and make sense of it. But the clue was always in the name, Out to Lunch, and it was partly, the name was conjured up actually by my business partner at the time. She said, well, that's where you are most of the time. But it also, as you know, in the American sense, means that you're not quite all there. That you're a little bit sort of like Daffy. And I thought that there was a reasonably good hint, if you wrote Out to Lunch, that you weren't supposed to take it terribly seriously. And of course, in the case of that particular article, and indeed ones before, people took it terribly seriously, as indeed they do with the articles on Politics Web. And which is, my greatest delight is watching the fury of people who respond to the columns. And of course, it's a lot easier to do on the internet than it is in a newspaper.
Because
it's immediate.
And as you say, and of course you have access to people all over the world who are reading these articles. Now, you say great delight. Really?
Yes.
It really did.
It wasn't my wife's great delight, but when I used to get death threats every Monday, I thought, whoa, we've hit target somewhere here.
So let's just talk about that. What does that mean? You're thick-skinned? Or does that
I'm
mean
very thick-skinned.
You like to provoke?
I like to provoke. I like to get people thinking, and I like to occasionally, just for the hell of it, say something which is going to sort of stir up the conversation. So I will play devil's advocate quite happily. And when people say, that they didn't believe something I wrote in an article, I said, well, don't worry, I very rarely believe things I write as well. And it is absolutely true when I say that. I'll throw something in just for the hell of it. because I think it's a good thing to do. And, Kingsley Amis, the great English novelist, once said, there's no point in writing unless you're going to upset somebody. And I don't remember many other things that Kingsley Amis said, but that was probably one of the things I do remember.
That's what stood out for you.
Yeah, I think.
Did you read the rest of what he said?
No, I have read
into context.
I read a bit more of him. Yeah, but the rest was very boring. But I think, Nikki, that's really what makes a good column. And we have to say, and let's put modesty aside because it's not one of my strong points here. Out to Lunch ran for 14 years. I'm not a journalist. I never had any journalistic training. It was and is, I think, still probably the best read column in South Africa.
1.7 million.
Apparently, that was according to the Sunday Times figures. But let's say they were exaggerating, it was 800,000. That's still a hell of a lot of readers. And as I said to you the other day when we chatted on the phone, 5 years after being sacked and sort of disgraced, in inverted commas, ex-columnist, there are still people who come up in restaurants and at airports and say, of all colours, I hasten to add, and say, we miss the column. We need a writer who's got kahunas who can actually tell it like it is. We didn't always agree with what you said. And that to me is music to my ears, because the last thing I want is somebody agreeing with everything I said. I want somebody to come up for a good knockdown argument, providing we do it in a civilised fashion.
What are your beliefs, David?
Well, it's a bit
you're
like,
wanting to provide.
I'm like an economist, it depends on the circumstances. They change every week. No, I believe, broadly speaking, that I'm very fortunate to live in the most stunning country in the world. I think the scenery is absolutely glorious, but I think more important than that, I think the people are absolutely fantastic. I think we have a very flawed political system, and I think that's a great pity, because I think in 1994 the prospectus suggested that things should be better than they are, and I think I would have been a lot happier to see much more delivery over the last 20 years. And I have to say that the reality is that if more money hadn't been lost in things like arms deals and other corrupt things, it would have gone to where it should have gone. Now, that doesn't make you very popular when you suggest that, but there is a fact of life that if billions hadn't disappeared in arms deals and in various other strange things that we all read about in the press day in, day out, a lot of people would have been a lot better off. I'm not suggesting jobs would have been created for everyone, but that to me is the sad thing about South Africa.
Well, how much was involved in the arms?
We don't know. Well, officially 43 billion at the time, but of course it then went up, and the costs went up, and there are various other costs. And we look at the mess ups with Eskom, and we look at the various. There's mess ups all over the place, and I think it's terribly sad, and it's almost impossible to count, because it just gets into the sort of the billions and probably the trillions. And you look at also the people who've benefited. I do strongly object to both BEE and AA in the way it was done. So a strong view I would have is there needed to be mentoring, and I think if there'd been mentoring where young people who hadn't been exposed, for example, to business, found a good business mentor, and then someone like Raymond Ackerman, for example, and then were allowed to proceed on their way and to learn about business and to understand, I think a lot more jobs would have been created. But you look around Joburg where we are, there are entrepreneurs, there are guys making wire animals. I couldn't even begin to start doing that. Now, there's a limit to how many wire animals you can have, unfortunately. But these people are entrepreneurs. They're sitting there working. The guys who wander around collecting plastic and paper from the dustbin, that is a damn hard work. There's no work shyness in Joburg, I don't think. And I think that, what you really need is to direct those people. So, for example, give the guys who collect the paper and the plastic trucks with slightly bigger wheels on. Would make life a lot easier. And then if the residents, and this is very simplistic, were encouraged to split their garbage between cardboard and plastic and glass and whatever, you've got a guy collecting it, makes his life a lot easier. It's little things like that. It's little sort of community things like that. I think that we have the desire to do it, but we all think, oh, why must we? Because the government's messed up and the billing system's a mess, etc., etc. So there's a sort of resentment, and I don't go along with it. I'm quite positive about South Africa in a sort of qualified way. But I think that we've deluded ourselves. We are no longer important. We're no longer living the sort of, shall we say, the rainbow honeymoon period. We've actually got to be competitive, and we're not.
But with the BEE, going back to that, and you saying that it hasn't been implemented properly and that mentorship would work, but don't you think that unless you have it within the system, it's not really going to happen? So you have to take that very standardized way and implement it properly before it can work.
Niki, I think I agree with that to an extent, but I think that when it was seen quite early on that it was only benefiting a handful of people, and how, we're talking about tens of millions and billions. There should have been some sort of tinkering there. I mean, when you've got Maletsi and Becky who criticises his own brother as well, and BEE, it clearly hasn't worked, and some people have become immensely wealthy, and many haven't. But it's, the thing, it could have been done better. There was, without doubt, you needed to actually redress many imbalances from pre-1994. And I don't think any sensible person would argue against that. But I think there are enough clever businessmen in this country to have actually come up with a better plan. And it could have been as simple as actually tax incentives. Every businessman loves a tax incentive. Everyone loves a tax incentive. So a tax incentive to bring on 10 people, but rather, onto your staff and to train them and to develop them, and then to train another 10 people. And that I really think that works. I mean, you've also got to have the right to get rid of people who are no good. And if you've got labour laws that make it very difficult to do that, you really have very little incentive to create jobs or to start businesses.
David, while you're talking, I'm thinking about all these discussions we can have. I mean, it is fascinating living in South Africa. There's never a dull day living in this country.
No, you won't.
And I'm just wondering, if you had to stay in the UK, would you have such interesting fodder? Would you be so inspired to write these fabulous columns?
Sky journalists, as well as everyone else, standing outside 2 doors with brass plates on, waiting for the announcement of a baby,
yes.
And trying to find something to say. I think we probably in this country would have flipped across there and said, we'll come back to you if something happens. Meanwhile, we've got a murder here, a car hijacking there. We've got gangsters trying to blow themselves up, James Bond style. It's never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment.
Never. And the sun shines.
If you have just tuned in, welcome. This is Conversations with Niki. I'm Niki Seberini, and I have David Bullard in the studio. David Bullard, of course, columnist, author, celebrity public speaker, and perhaps you followed his column for many, many years, because it wasn't just 14 years, David. It was 17, because you were sacked after
actually,
14.
It's sort of still going.
Yes.
So, the column after the Sunday Times, there was a 2-month lull while I actually went on holiday. And then it was picked up by a website called Free Racer, which was then acquired by MoneyWeb when Alec Hogg was at MoneyWeb.
Mm-hmm.
So a column appeared on MoneyWeb, then appeared on Politics Web for a bit. It also appeared on another column. In addition to that, appeared on a website called News Time. And yet a third column appeared on joburg.coza.
So this whole concept of David Bullard's shame and jobless and starving on the side of the road is certainly not.
I've got to say, it spawned 3 columns rather than 1 column a week, and 2 of those had corporate sponsors. One was sponsoring at 70,000 rand a month, one was sponsoring at slightly less. I think I'm still true to say that I'm the only online columnist that's ever had a corporate sponsor. They didn't sponsor for very long, and there's a good reason for that, because they couldn't quite see the bang for the buck. They weren't getting what they call click-throughs, but I still think it's quite encouraging that a man disgraced so badly for letting down the mighty Sunday Times should find not 1 but 3 columns to go on.
Amazing. By the way, we are taking your calls. David, would you like to?
Yes,
would you like people to call in? All right,
certainly.
so should we open the lines?
We're very happy to do
You're
that.
ready for
yes,
that? I know
indeed.
you are. All right, so the number to dial is 011 880 5839. If you have any questions for David Bullard, perhaps you've got a story that you'd like to share with David, 011 880 5839. Also, the show is being podcast. What I do is I podcast each show on my website, conversationswithniki.co.za, Niki spelled Niki. So if you do miss a part of the show, you can take a listen to that podcast. Now, Conversations with Niki is sponsored by Study Apps, and interestingly enough, studies have shown that students retain 50% more of the information that they've learned if they take practice tests while they're learning. And Study Apps provides all the practice tests any student could ever ask for in an interactive and stimulating way. And they have been offering Study Apps to schools, but I do believe that in the next month they are going to be going public. So you, instead of sitting for hours testing yourself or your kids or your grandkids or whatever it is, you can join Study Apps, and it just makes the whole learning that much easier. It's about studying smarter, not necessarily harder. So go along to their website, studyapps.co.za, spelled STUDYAPPS. So, David, we have been skirting around the article.
Yes.
the article, and you were called this racist. And just let's for those listeners who have no idea about the particular article, the column on that day, perhaps you can just fill us in.
Yeah, it was probably actually one of 3 articles, because racism was very much in the news at the time, and it was becoming quite absurd. There were all sorts of strange things. I think it was the I can't remember, wasn't it the Association of Black Journalists of South Africa or something threw somebody out because they were the wrong colour. There was all sorts of bizarre things happening back then anyway. So I wrote a couple of columns. I wrote a couple just before this one appeared, and this was like the third in a series of saying, isn't this a ridiculous thing? And this column was, and I have to say that I didn't put the headline on. The headline was "Uncolonized Africa Wouldn't Know When It Was Missing." So when they said that it had slipped through the system, we immediately said, well, who put the headline on? They said, oops. Actually didn't slip through the system. We were lying about that. But it was actually, it asked you to imagine what South Africa would have been like if it hadn't been colonized. And it actually painted, I thought, an incredibly attractive picture of a place that didn't have cell phones, didn't have a cable TV or satellite TV, where people actually had a rather nice lifestyle. And the whole story actually is that something is missing, because what was happening then is the whole thing about race is you had to have someone to blame. And this was a small element, and particularly I think of the ruling party, but you always had to have someone to blame, and it was always either apartheid or colonialism or whatever else. It hasn't rained for 3 days, oh, it's for Wut's fault, or whatever else, or my tyre burst in a pot, oh, it's for Wut's fault and it's apartheid's fault. And it was to make a mockery of that. And so suddenly the Chinese arrive, and this is actually before the Chinese really arrived. Suddenly the Chinese arrive, and of course all the indigenous population of South Africa look up to the sky and think, oh, at last we find out what's been missing in our lives. At last we have someone to blame. And that was really what it was.
And there it was. And when you finished writing it, did you look and go, okay, this
was pretty good.
This could be a little controversial.
I knew it was going to be controversial. I thought this is pretty good and pretty tongue-in-cheek, and it's bound to get some response. Because let's be honest. Because
you were paid to be controversial.
Well, I was actually. That's what I thought the brief was, and they'd paid me rather well. They were paying me at an incredibly high rate to bring in readers to the careers section of the Sunday Times. And I have to say, this was the most valuable advertising real estate in the paper, according to an advertising person who I worked with, who has since left.
Mm-hmm.
But there were companies that said, please, can we have an advert next to the Out to Lunch column, because they knew that that's what people would be reading. Even if they didn't buy the paper, they'd sneak into CNA, and they'd flip over to the third section, and they'd read it. So it was very valuable real estate. From an advertising point of view. So you had to be controversial. We didn't have to be, but it made sense, because every week you wanted to try attract some readers. And yes, there was going to be the hate mail, and there were going to be those who objected and those who said rah rah, well done. So in this particular case,
you knew it was going to be controversial.
Yeah, this was actually written on the 1st of April, on a Tuesday, for the 6th of April edition on the Sunday. And went in, and there was the usual outcry, which had been the week before and probably in the previous 14 years. And I thought nothing more about it.
And when did you realize that it was going to get a lot bigger?
Well, when the editor, Monley McCanya, said, I thought your article was very racist, I said, well, why did you put it in the paper? And as I said, he didn't have an answer to that. And then various other journalists started complaining, because understandably, they were very envious that someone who wasn't a journalist was getting 1.7 million readers. So what do? You put the boot in. You think, it's a good way of getting rid of the big tusker. Get him out the way, maybe there's a chance for me. And that's really what it was, Niki. I think, we had one or two. Kalela Manku wrote a piece in Business Day that said, we have got to sack this guy. He must be prosecuted for hate speech, etc., etc. There were 3 complaints, I think, to the Human Rights Commission. As one of which was dropped, and it was all systems go. So I said to the Human Rights Commission, tell me what you want to know, and I'll give you a response. I gave them a response, and I haven't had a response to the response in 5 years. I bumped into the head of the Human Rights Commission when I was emceeing a do, and I put my arms together and said, have you got the handcuffs? Take me away now. He rolled his eyes and said, how embarrassing, because sure, this is about freedom of speech. My editor didn't defend me, as we know, and quite a few other people didn't either. And then, of course, the cry to be taken to the Equity Court for hate speech, I said, well, go ahead. It's fine. The law must take its course. Needless to say, nothing happened on that. Now, when the article was republished in the book Out to Lunch Ungagged, there was not a single complaint. And it was it's an annotated version.
Yes,
it actually adds to the problem if instead of taking away, not a single complaint to the Human Rights Commission, which shows how hypocritical it was in the first place. Because if you'd missed the first chance to actually level a charge of hate speech against me, here I was in 2011 giving you another chance to do so. How fair can I be, really? I mean,
David, when I read it, there were times when I had to pause and I felt my eyes watering a little bit.
And cringe.
And I'd carry on, and there would definitely be a cringe.
Yes.
I cringed the whole way through. But again, as I said, I mean, that's how I started off. Following you, there have been times when you've shocked me. There have been times when you've angered me. There have been times when you've filled me with joy, laughter, mirth, everything, the range of emotions. This one, as I said, my eyes watered. And it's got me thinking because, from your stance, your point of view, would I call you a racist, or would I call you a person who's simply challenging who we are, how we see the world, and what's wrong with challenging? So the question I have to ask is this: do you think that, though, because if you had written a similar article about, Spanish people, or if you had found yourself in England and writing an article about a current situation in England, going back in time and using that scenario, would there have been such an outcry? And I don't know if there would have. And I think it has obviously a lot to do with our history and that we are a bruised nation.
Look, I think that there are various issues there. I mean, firstly, my former editor, the one who sacked me, described me in the foreword to the previous book rather proudly as an equal opportunity dispenser of lethal barbs. And that was why he was very proud to have me on there. And he said that a column is valuable real estate, and I did a great job with the valuable real estate. And then he changed his mind. You can't have it both ways. And if you're going to talk about, the accusations there of coming up with offensive stereotypes. Well, if you're a stereotype, you may or may not be offensive, but you can't get by without stereotypes. We know that white men can't jump. That's an offensive stereotype. If you wanted to be a stereotype, well, some of us can. We know that the English couldn't cook. Maybe that's changed a little bit now. Where do you stop it? I think the thing that upset people mostly
exactly
in that
where
column,
do you stop the stereotype, especially in South Africa?
This was an article which was taking the mick out of stereotypes by actually over-exaggerating the offensive stereotypes in the thinking that the reader was intelligent enough to understand the word irony as to mean something that wasn't used to build bridges. It would be perhaps a little bit more subtle than that. We had a loud, vociferous group of people who it went way over their heads.
Oh, it touched a nerve.
Decided to be, and it certainly touched a nerve, decided to be deeply and mortally offended by this. And in the same way, it would be quite a good excuse to get rid of a white writer on a newspaper and save a bit of cost on there, because they needed to bring costs down the Sunday Times at those stages, And I'm unapologetic about it. I apologised after on Business Day to those who were genuinely offended, and the operative word there is genuinely. But I actually don't make any apology for writing it. I don't make any apology for republishing it. You can be offended at anything. I think
this is what I was
we have
going
a lot
to
of people
say.
in South Africa, particularly in the media, who like to get out of bed in the morning and say, I'm going to be offended by something today, and I don't get offended by very much. So probably my thick skin is actually not very useful there, because it takes a hell of a lot to offend me. I shrug my shoulders and say, that's fine. Go with whatever.
Well, that's it. We all see the world differently, don't we? And we all respond to things because of experiences. And we all see it and experience it differently.
I've been called homophobic and misogynistic and racist and speciesist.
And yet people come back and read and want to,
you've got to tick
read
all
your
those
column.
boxes, and I think, well, quite frankly, we talked about offending people. I mean, my editor complained that he used to get calls from people who objected to the word POM. I said, well, I'm allowed to use the word POM because I am one. No, you've offended people. And I think it was quite good. And oddly enough, and we know this on the website column, I mean, people will come back every week at the same time at 1:30 in the morning in South Africa to see if the Out to Lunch column is up on Politics Web so they can be offended by it. And I'm delighted because some of their comments are actually even funnier than the article.
Well, I love that you're delighted. It
Yeah.
goes back to the thick skin, because
You wouldn't do it
I
if
think
you-
it would destroy me every week if someone was took delight in pulling me down. But this is what makes you right
Do you know what
and
it is,
move
Nikki?
forward.
It's the supreme arrogance of knowing that I am so damn good that everyone else is wrong about this.
Out of the
So
mouth
I
of
listen to
Mr.
the
Bullard.
criticism and ignore it.
Love it. Listen, we're going to take a break, and after the break, let's talk about racism. I want to know what do you think racism is, and is this word overused in South Africa today? We'll be right back.
Great.
Hi, my name is S.V. Prinsloo, and I'm the HOD of IT Integration at Bridwin Preparatory School in Melrose. We started using study apps about 6 months ago and have seen astonishing results. We were quite amazed to see how quickly the kids have been able to use study apps and the benefits it has shown with regards to reinforcing what they've already learned inside the classroom. I would highly recommend study apps for any school.
Studyapps.co.za. Welcome back. Conversations with Niki. You're with Niki Seberini, and Conversations with Niki is brought to you by studyapps.co.za. I'd like to welcome the syndication partner listeners, 90.3 MC FM in Plet, Neisner FM, Wild Coast FM in East London, and Bay FM in PE. Wonderful to have you on board. I have David Bullard in the studio, columnist, author, celebrity public speaker, sharing his stories, and we've been talking about that column because we all know about that column in 2008 that got David sacked from the Sunday Times. And we're just talking about this whole concept of the way we see the world and how we all respond differently to things. But I do think that with our very dark past, we are a bruised nation. And I think that David was talking about stereotypes in the first half. And that I think that in some instances, it's very easy to use stereotypes. And I think in South Africa, to use other stereotypes, we have to be very, very careful. Or do we have to be very careful, David? So let's talk about this whole concept of racism. Let's talk about when things happened, the race card is used. And it is still used after so many years of living in a democratic South Africa. It's still a huge issue. So I'll start off by asking you, I mean, what is racism to you?
I think that you're absolutely right. It is used, and it's overused, and it's generally used to stop the debate. And there is an element of society who will cry racism, or they'll cry sexism, they'll cry whatever, to stop the debate. And so it's really shouting down the opposition. I don't think racism is at all difficult to identify. It's very simple. The original word, of course, will be racialism, and it's a belief that one particular group of people, and it's nothing to do with colour, is actually inferior to another, should be treated as inferior to another within a society. And I don't believe that many people would think that that's a particularly good system of government or system of society whatsoever. However, there is no doubt in my mind that there are some races that are infinitely superior to my race at building sports cars, for example. Now, does that make me a racist? British used to build very good sports cars. They don't do it anymore. I would say that it probably goes to the Italians, I regret to say, and the Germans, etc. Now, that's racism, because I've then said, well, those people are actually better than me. What is the Olympics if it's not racist? It's actually pitting one nation against another to see which nation has the better athletes. Well, I know this is an extreme example, but you have to throw the extreme examples back at people and say, right, that's really what it's all about. We inevitably will compare. We get back to stereotypes. Stereotypes is a very easy way of classifying, for want of a better word, an entire nation, because you can't say, if you say that Holland is flat and wet, it's not flat and wet every day. It's sometimes dry, but it's pretty flat. And if they get upset about that, well, bad luck. But that is generally the thing. You generally have another view that Irish are pretty thick and they're manual labourers, etc., etc. That's hugely offensive to most Irishmen. But if you say that they're a warm, wonderful nation who actually make great beer, etc., etc., that's also a stereotype. It's a stereotype that they happen to approve of. So the first point is, if you actually have a stereotype that people generally don't approve of or take offence to, then you've got a problem. Now, should you then ban people from saying, listen, I actually think you are absolutely useless at making sports cars, and I'm actually going to write about this and say this on a regular basis, and I don't mind if you do actually have a bit of a tiz about it, or on other issues as well. So you get down to the situation, I think, Niki, in South Africa, you say, do we have a national sense of humour? And I actually think we do have a national sense of humour, and I think that most of my readers of all colours had a great sense of the ridiculous, and a lot of those columns were really about the ridiculous. And frankly, if someone gets offended, bad luck. You're going to get offended next week, you're going to get offended the week after. You need to sort out something within yourself, because either I've rubbed a scab off a wound and I'm actually horribly near the truth, and you don't like being told the truth, or you're just being gratuitously offended on behalf of everyone else. Why can't you make gay jokes? I mean, I've got a lot of gay friends who make gay jokes about themselves. Am I allowed to make gay jokes about them? Well, actually, I do make gay jokes about them, but we get to those sort of ridiculous things and it gets terribly precious. And you then risk having a situation where you inhibit freedom of speech and freedom of expression.
So do you think, what do you think really the importance is of having this kind of freedom of speech, is pointing these, bringing in the stereotypes, being obvious about certain racist remarks? Do you think it benefits a society?
Well,
do you think
I
it
think
gets
it
us
does.
talking openly about
Who's
things?
allowed to and who's? Trevor Noah is allowed to. Nick Rabinovitz is
So
allowed
true.
to. Zapira is
And we
allowed
have such
to.
a good laugh.
I'm not, because you might misinterpret some of the words. So must you have an English lesson before you read the David Bullard Out to Lunch column so you understand the irony and the subtleties of the thing? We get to that situation. So you've got certain people who are licensed to be as rude as they like about entire racial groups, and yet if you write something like Cooley Roberts did about the coloureds, which was very tongue-in-cheek, clearly very tongue-in-cheek, and then she lost the column for that. I don't think that I read a single outraged column from a coloured. I read a lot of outraged comments from white women speaking on behalf of coloured people who had never read the column, because they thought that Cooley should be punished for offending people who they'd never met. And that's how ridiculous it gets. So you'll see, particularly on Twitter, as we know, you'll get people massively outraged about all sorts of things. I'll give you an example. I was on Twitter once, and we'd had a very windy day in Joburg, and just for the hell of it, I put up on the Twitter thing that the strong winds in Joburg had undone all the good work done by the garden boy earlier on. And I sat with my coffee waiting for the comments.
Did you?
Yeah. Now, I was the
David.
garden boy. Who's to decide who the garden boy is? But they're, and I then pointed out,
And you
and
knew-
they suddenly
you
went
knew
quiet.
what response
I
you were
had
gonna get.
masses of, oh, you're a dinosaur. You're this. It was me with the leaf blower. I was the garden boy that day. But to use the word garden boy immediately implied something. And then I played it out a little bit. I did say, well, what else do you call a 12-year-old, who prunes the roses? Perhaps we're going to buy him some gardening gloves for his 13th birthday if he's good. And you just play it out, and you get all this sort of all these trendoids coming on and getting angry, and then you say, actually, he doesn't exist. It's an imaginary world. You've just been led down the garden path, and you've wasted all that fury for no reason at all.
But it came out. The point is that it comes out.
Yeah.
So do you think we have enough healthy debate? Because clearly, you're there and you just touch that right little nerve and you get the response that you want, and you're doing it very consciously. You know exactly what you're doing, and people are responding. But because people are responding like that, do you think that we have a huge need for people to be debating, to be sitting and talking about issues and bringing all of it up?
Well,
and if we did, do you think we would have a better sense of humour?
No, we would. I'm banned from, I'm told I'm banned from Wits Business School. And that I would have thought was an institution was interested in freedom of expression and debate, but I'm told I'm banned from being on campus there and being on a panel. I'm banned from quite a few other places because of the article. And no,
It's
we don't
terribly
have.
sad,
We don't.
David.
Well, it's not really, because in fact you wouldn't want to be in a room with the sort of people who've got that attitude anyway. On the other hand, I've been involved in various other debates and various other discussions where it's been very lively. And of course, if you've been sacked from the Sunday Times for writing, in inverted commas, a racist column, it's pretty good for after dinner speaking, because what do you want to do after dinner at a golf club? Listen to some old bore going on about agricultural policy of the homelands in the Dark Ages, or someone who's been sacked from the Sunday Times who might be deeply offensive and will certainly liven the evening up over the brandies? Well, the answer was the second. So. And I think that there is still, we don't discuss things enough, and I think there is very definitely a massive political correctness in certain newspapers and on radio. You need wackos. And my views every so often are just deliberately wacko, but there are some people who are genuinely wacko out there who really we do need to hear their views, because if you pretend they don't exist, or if you shout them down or push them out, well, then you're never going to know. And then you've got these sort of strange subversive people who suddenly, for no apparent reason, blow up a petrol station or something like that. Let's hear the views and let's rationally shout them down.
Rationally shout them
down. Exactly.
Do you regret writing that column?
No, not at all.
No regret at all?
None at all.
And your wife, does she regret it? Because I can only imagine that her life, because while you're making the decisions and you have the thick skin, you're doing it and you know what you're doing, but she's your wife.
Well, she worked
and she's got to go and have coffee down the road.
No, she worked in the same building. She got in the lift every day with the man who sacked her husband.
Oh, no.
She was working at Financial Mail, yeah. So for the next, 3 or 4 years, she was actually interacting with the people who'd actually got rid of her husband. And of course, get in the lift with somebody, and they sort of look and say, "Oh my God, what do we say?" It's like you've been diagnosed with cancer, and no one knows quite what to say. How's your husband? I mean, I know he's dying, but I mean, how is he? I mean, I know he's unemployed. I mean, what's he doing?
Ouch,
and they sort of do it.
Uncomfortable.
Like, how is David now? Well, actually,
how are you?
David was very fine because, I was still driving fast cars. I still had a TV show for a bit. I was still writing for magazines. I was still trotting off on exotic trips. Nothing had changed. The only thing that had changed is I didn't receive a paycheck every month from the Sunday Times. I received it from somebody else. So what's the difference?
Listen, let's talk about your former boss, editor of the Sunday Times then, Mondli Makanya.
Yes.
Because you then, not so long ago, didn't you charge him?
We
laid criminal charges
laid
against
him? Which, oddly enough, the NPA decided not to go ahead with. But it was a pretty cut and dry case. He'd introduced evidence in a court case between myself and Avusa, as it was then. He'd introduced a forged document. And he'd introduced it as evidence. And by and large, it was a contract purporting to be with Fred Khumalo, dated 2004, on Avusa notepaper. Avusa weren't trading in 2004. So it took us another 6 months to bring that in. We laid the complaint, but they decided that they weren't going to prosecute. But it can't have been on lack of evidence. We can only guess as to why they didn't prosecute. We didn't think they would prosecute, Niki, I have to say. We thought they'd lose the docket or something because, when you're dealing with a large and basically dishonest organisation, and I have to say that other actions that the Sunday Times and their owners have done. I mean, there's an article in the book there where one big legal firm threatens to sue me for defamation, and we just said, we'll bring it on, we'll see you in court, look forward to it. We heard nothing more, needless to say.
Mondli Makanya, the former editor and your boss at the time, as you say, I mean, forwards in other books, he raved about you. Out to Lunch is a dream column for any editor to have in their newspaper. It is an equal opportunity dispenser of lethal barbs. And there are many, many other quotes where he is, and he lauds you and supports you. Did you have a good relationship with him?
I did, yes. We used to go and drink whiskey for 6 hours together, which I think may have been the problem. I might have actually turned him on to that drug. And that's possibly why he was dozing when he should have been editing the newspaper. So
were you disappointed that he responded this way, that he didn't have your back?
I think he's disappointed as well. I mean, he's now out of a job. I mean, he was editor and then he was promoted to the sort of non-position of editor-in-chief, and he was booted from that last year. So I think he's sort of biding his time at home at the moment and apparently writing a book.
You haven't spoken?
No,
you're not in touch at all.
No, not at all. We've sort of seen him in court occasionally, but I think he's actually. I'm told by others that he was quite ashamed of what he had to do, but I suspect that he was pushed into doing it. But of course, once you've done it, you've done it. You've got to stand up for your writers. What you do in that situation is you open the letters page and you then get it all out of the way, and then you move on. But they decided to go a different route. And I think honestly, Niki, I think it has actually been more detrimental to them than it has to me. I have never had a problem writing for anyone else after that. I had one or two people say, look, we'd rather not use you because of what has happened. But that was to be expected. People are sensitive about offending clients. I think the Sunday Times, on the other hand, has watched its sales drop from 520,000 to below 400,000 and maybe even lower than that in the 5 years. And as I said, people still say to me, we don't buy it anymore. It's not our paper. It's not aimed at us. It doesn't got the sort of stuff it had in. Because, I was also writing about cars then for 7 years. I mean, I wasn't the motoring editor, but that was bringing in incredible revenue. Nobody wrote about cars until I started doing it there in, I think, 2001, 2002. And, for example, a wraparound for the lifestyle section would be 400,000 Rand. Well, that only happens, BMW only do that if someone's writing about cars. So every month there are 4 newspapers. Well, let's say there's a wraparound 2 weeks. That's 800,000 Rand of advertising I'm bringing in addition to other advertising as well. Not me bringing in, but my presence is bringing in. So it's a very real. It was a very real hit to them. It was a very stupid move actually for them to do. Cost them credibility. In the sense that now everyone knows that the Sunday Times is a paper that sort of believes in freedom of speech unless it doesn't actually believe in it. So, we were talking about being bold before. You will only, as a paid columnist, as a paid journalist working for any newspaper group, write something if you think that they can't sack you after it's been written. How bold are you going to be? I mean, if you're relying on a paycheck every month, and the new rules are the editor can sack you for something that he's published and claims not to have read, you can't possibly have a free press and a vibrant press if you've got those rules in place.
Welcome. If you have just tuned in, this is Conversations with Niki. I'm Niki Seberini. I have David Bullard in the studio. Incidentally, if you would like to call in, the lines are open, 011-880-5839. We're just listening to David's stories, really, his life story growing up in England, being in the financial market for 24 years, the midlife crisis, becoming such a successful journalist and columnist, and really something you stumbled across, David.
True midlife crisis.
And so that's really the discussion that we're having. So if you'd like to join it, please do, 011-880-5839, and this conversation will be podcast and put onto my website, Conversations with Niki. So David, what I find quite interesting though is that this column, you were sacked in 2008, and today I was reading an article that you wrote about an editor for the Mail and Guardian. You were again quite outspoken. Are there no black editors for newspapers these days? And you wrote this whole article, and of course you get this flood of response, and people still alluding to the fact that you were fired. And they talk about they talk about the fact that I've lost my train of thought. So have we got a caller? Fantastic. Hi there.
Hello, Niki. Well done. My name is Diane.
Hi, Diane.
And I'm loving your program, and I'm loving David Bullard on your program. So, David, you are delicious. You're too wonderful to listen to. Everything that Niki said you are. But I need one little question. When your article was in the Sunday Times, and you resigned, and the editor said, don't resign, and then 2 days later you were fired. Was that intentionally done so that they wouldn't look like the bad boys? I mean, you would be the bad guy. You couldn't resign. You had to be fired.
Yeah, I think, Diane. Well, thank you for your compliments. We've opened the door so my ego can slip out there and get a bit more room. But no, I think that's exactly it, because I thought, very simply, I can't have a relationship with an editor who publishes a column and then tells me that what he thought was racist. It could happen again next week. So it was no skin off my nose. I had other stuff going on, and I thought, well, rather than have a bad relationship, the exact words I used to him, let's pull the column. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, no more out to lunch. He said, no, that's not necessary. Fortunately, I came out of the meeting and told 2 other leading journalists, one of actually who reminded me and one who's actually quite a key guy around town. So I had a bit of backup there in the sense of, people otherwise would say, oh, you imagined it or you made it up. But no, I think that's exactly it. They took until Thursday to do the sacking, and they thought, well, listen, if he resigns, it all looks too clean.
It would be loss of faith.
Yeah, we can, if we sack him, we can then get on John Robbie's show and we can put the boot in and we can really go to town. And as I said to Niki, I think that probably backfired on them, because I think intelligent readers of the Sunday Times and of many other newspapers probably saw right the way through that after when the facts came out.
Well, I have to tell you, we miss you terribly in the Sunday Times. In fact, I don't really read it anymore. But I loved your column. We went straight there. So it's lovely to hear you on radio, David. I'd love to hear more of you, Niki.
Thanks, Dan.
Just to thank you for a wonderful wonderful, wonderful program.
Thank you for calling,
Thanks, Diane.
Diane.
Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, if you'd like to also call in, if you have any questions for David, 011-880-5839. So I remember where I was going with my comment. I was saying that people were still alluding to the fact that you had been sacked by the Sunday Times. This is something that happened in 2008. We're in 2013, and people are still talking
It's
about
a legacy, I believe.
It really is.
This is a legacy, and I tell you, it's a brand.
It's amazing. It's still alive and kicking.
It's a brand. And I said earlier, I'm not ashamed of it. And we were talking about various other descriptions, and am I happy with them? And I'm very happy with that brand because you've seen on my Twitter page where I describe myself as Comrade Mdava. I was given that name incidentally by a very left-wing black journalist.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And it's a sort of a fond name. Comrade Mdava is one of South Africa's most popular black columnists. Due to a genetic disorder known as Englishness, his skin can appear pale on occasions. And I think that's probably been the cause of getting quite a few more followers, because they think, well, anyone who can write that is clearly not taking himself too seriously. I think the mistake is that too many other people take me far more seriously than I've ever taken myself.
Yourself, I think so. And maybe we should all be a little light on everything, really.
That's their problem. But that's why you can sort of get away with, gingering things up and doing these things,
David Bullard, what fills you with joy?
What fills me with joy is the bush, I have to say. I'm addicted to the bush, particularly when an animal is in the right position and the sun is in the right position and all the settings on the camera are there and it's a perfect focus. So that's great. But
is that a great time out for you?
Yeah, even without the camera, I'm going up to the Madikwe in a couple of weeks' time. Even without the camera, I think it is one of the most incredible experiences, and it's a sort of lifetime dream holiday if you live in Europe. Here, it's 4 hours away. We can all do it 2 or 3 times a year, whether it's Kruger or whatever. I think the fact is that you're in an animal's territory. This is not a zoo. Anything can happen. And I was in Kruger last year, and this massive bull elephant was walking down the road with its trunk hung over its tusk, and we reversed 1.5 kilometers down because we really did not want to confront this thing, and it had its way. It was, we thought, please get off the road, please, because we were reversing into a cul-de-sac.
He was walking on the road towards you.
On the road, chewing with a thing over there, and he was huge, and you couldn't go up and sort of hoot away. And I think that the fact that you're in the wild and anything can happen, and I've been very lucky over 20, 30 years to see an awful lot of fantastic game, but I never tire, so that makes me happy. And Joburg makes me hugely happy. The first time the other day I actually climbed the Westcliff stairs.
Where are the Westcliff stairs?
They're actually off the Crescent in Westcliff, and you climb right up to opposite the Ridge School, and they've been there for ages. And
what a view! It must be
it's
beautiful.
Fantastic, and it's good exercise. A lot of joggers go up there, but it's one of the sort of things that you need to do. I go out walking every morning. I think that pavements accepted, Joburg is generally pretty beautiful during the winter.
During the winter? I thought you were going to say during the summer.
And during
the winter, I
lovely.
think a little ugly, but we won't go there.
Wonderful sort of sunsets. You still get a lot of blossoms on trees and things. Nice blue skies all year round.
So then I suppose I have to ask you, what depresses you? Do you ever get depressed?
No, I don't actually. No, I don't really get depressed. I think
if you did, you'd be in a dangerous
I get down
position.
where I said where I think of what could have been in this country and it hasn't been. And corruption, reading about corruption and things like that depresses me, which is why I don't read newspapers. I will read something on the tablet. But I tend not to read newspapers because I do find the news terribly depressing. But I think every country has crime. I just think that we have rather more than our fair share. But otherwise, no, I'm sort of reasonably cheerful individual.
And what makes you angry?
Probably once again, other people driving. Everyone is a worse driver than I am, by definition.
Of course. I can only imagine that you are a superb driver.
I avoid bad traffic. I think traffic does make me angry. Bad traffic.
Who's not affected?
No, that makes me angry. And I think once again, mismanagement makes me angry, and things not being delivered on time. Things not happening. If your electricity is out, you should be able to make 2 or 3 phone calls, and you should get a number, and something should get sorted out. So that sort of thing makes me angry, but not apoplectic. I don't want too high a blood pressure.
Do you lose your temper?
No, very rarely. I used to. When I was in financial markets, but it was only when I'd lost $500,000 in a morning. It was a bit tense.
Well, that could upset anybody.
Yeah, but I got over that. And then I realised it was somebody else's money I was losing, so it didn't matter.
And what? You've said that you walk. and you enjoy the bush. But what else do you do to relax? I think gardening. We mentioned gardening.
Well, I don't
You were the
garden.
garden
No, I
boy,
enjoy the
weren't you?
garden. No, my wife is in charge of the garden, but I'm sort of quite interested, which is an understatement, in food and drink.
And well, we know whiskey. You enjoy a good whiskey.
I enjoy wines. And I've really got into photography quite recently, and have done some sort of interesting shoots around the place. But because that's all about light, I can't paint, and I can't draw to save my life, so I have to use a camera. But music, I mean, I love music, rock music and opera, all the way
Rock
through.
music.
Yeah, all the way
Which
through.
rock bands? Come on, Dave.
Well, I mean, I'm afraid to go back to Led Zeppelin era, So I'm sort of.
You're a
of
Led
that,
Zeppelin fan.
I'm of that era, and various other strange obscure, and of course Beatles and Stones. I think the Stones have got to be one of the finest acts ever. I mean, it's still together.
And they are still around,
they're
performing.
phenomenal.
Aren't they
And
incredible?
Those songs are superb. I mean, they really are superb, and they're incredible performers. And I just feel very sorry for the non-baby boomer generation who've had to grow up with complete rubbish to listen to. And of course, they all listen to our music now. I mean, I've got a 21-year-old nephew who plays a great guitar, and he listens to all the guitarists that I used to worship. Led Zeppelin and Eric Clapton and all those guys. And Deep Purple, I mean, he listens to all that stuff because that's actually better music.
The
If you want to learn
legends,
to play the guitar.
the legends,
Yeah,
David. It's Conversations with Niki, David Bullard in the studio. And if you would like to call in, the number to dial is 011-880-5839. David Bullard, columnist, author, celebrity, public speaker, also known for his controversial satire. And we are going to be podcasting this show, so you just need to go to the website Conversations with Niki, and we'll be putting the show on tomorrow. Study Apps is a proud sponsor of Conversations with Niki, and statistics have shown, and you may be interested in this, David, that if students do not review what they have learned, they will forget 70% within an hour and 84% within 48 hours. Now I know what I was doing. Now I know what I was doing wrong. The key to effective long-term learning is testing, and that's what Study Apps is all about. They are the leaders in revision and test preparation. Study smarter and not harder. Go to their website, studyapps.co.za. So, David, we're just talking about things that excite you, things that relax you, things that make you happy. What is a dream of yours? I mean, I can imagine that you've probably ticked quite a few boxes in your lifetime, but you still have many.
Get there actually, because we're actually moving out of Johannesburg after, in my case, 32 years, and going down to live in the winelands. And I think that has been a sort of a dream for a while, because it's a glorious area, and my wife is a Joburg girl, has lived here all her life, and it's taken a bit of persuading. But the persuasion is that you get up in the morning, you do different things to the sort of things you do in Joburg. So you might go look at the whales down at De Hoop. You might go up the west coast and look at the flowers if they're in season. You might go to Paternoster or somewhere like that. And I think it's going to be quite an interesting sort of change of pace. I've got a lot of friends down there already, and a lot of friends who've moved down there. So I think, I'm now 60, well, I'll be 61 this year, and my wife is very, very slightly older. And I think
you shouldn't have said that, David.
Very, very slightly older.
You should not have said that.
I'm a toy boy, you see, this is the thing. And I just think it's quite fun at a certain stage of life to say, right, let's go and do something completely new and have a change of scenery.
Are you a bit nervous about this move?
Yeah, we are. A bit daunting. It's very nervous, but every time I open a wardrobe or a cupboard, there's 22 years of accumulated rubbish to be
it's going to be
out.
a great spring clean.
It's going to be a great spring clean. I think the charities are going to do remarkably well out of it, and we're going to be sort of downsizing in stuff to take down there, but no, I think that's going to be quite fun. And I will continue writing. I write for a magazine called Prestige at the moment, which is a nice glossy magazine, which is available in most of the, I think, business class lounges, and then CNA and various other places. But like most magazines, it's sort of it's looking for a place to be, and I think it's very difficult when you're competing on the shelf with other magazines. My feeling is it should be dropped into polo clubs and things like that, because that's the sort of.
And what's your article in Prestige?
I do feature. I did 5 pages on the Okavango Delta a bit earlier on this year.
Did you have to travel
I did,
there?
I'm
just
afraid
to
I had to go there.
Must have been awful for
I'm
you.
doing Madikwe for the magazine. I've done 500 at the Saxon, reviewed David Higgs's fantastic restaurant there. I've done DW 1113. So it's sort of food, drink, wine, travel. In fact, the Madikwe one is actually going to be a car and the Tower Lodge. So I'm driving a Porsche Cayenne diesel up there.
Again,
under
such
sufferance.
hardship, really.
Yeah, I did say, can't you give me the turbo? They said, no, it's too fast for you. You wouldn't know how to handle it.
Oh.
No, I've actually driven the turbo, so they want to give me the diesel. So that'll be great. So, when people feel sorry for me for no longer having a job at the Sunday Times, there are one or two little bright spots every month to look forward to. I mean, the rest of the time is darkness and despair.
And of course,
absolutely.
And
of course, I mean,
which is why you're escaping to the
can only
winelands.
afford cheap cigars and rubbish whiskey these days. The cheapest non-main brand stuff. But every so often, during the month, there are 2 or 3 days of brightness which lift my life a little bit and just tempt me to keep going for another month. Maybe.
Oh, I'm closing my eyes. Listen, when are you writing a new book?
I don't think I am. Publishers, my publishers of the third book, who did remarkably well out of it, dropped me like a hot potato when the incident happened.
The article.
And of course, the latest book wasn't reviewed by anyone in the media, largely because it was very rude about all the sort of people who might have wanted to review the book.
Out to lunch and ungagged.
Ungagged. Those are the articles that were written post the sacking. And actually, I have to say, it is the best of all 4
it's lovely.
books.
It's wonderful.
But it sold quite well, but it's very difficult to go to a publisher and say, look, it was touch and go, wasn't it, last time? And
Let's try again.
Would you like to do another one? He was very brave to do it. It was 2 dogs who did it, and it was a fantastic gesture on his part.
I have a feeling there will be another book. I think once you've been in the winelands and you've sipped enough wine and you've travelled around enough and seen those beautiful scenes, you may be motivated. David, I could spend so many more hours chatting. I feel like we have just really scratched the surface, and perhaps you'll join me once again when you're up from the lovely winelands, and you'll join us once again on Conversations with Niki. It has been an absolute joy, David Bullard.
Thanks, Niki. Thank you very much indeed. Pleasure as well.
Thank you so much. David Bullard on Conversations with Niki. As I said, the show will be podcast, www.conversationswithniki.co.za. I hope that you have enjoyed the last hour. I certainly have. And by the way, go and get a copy of the book, Out to Lunch Ungagged, David Bullard. I've spent the last week in bed laughing to myself and thoroughly enjoying it. I hope you have, and I'm looking so forward to being with you same time next week. Take care. Conversations with Niki was brought to you by studyapps.co.za, South Africa's leading education app for tablets.